Now, please welcome Anne Kirker.
Mm-hmm. Kia ora. It's wonderful to be back in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It really is. Thank you for inviting me, Rana. I haven't got notes. I've got some fresh impressions, and some of them actually feed into this talk based on the London years of Lye. But the first impressions I have of re-looking at the information that has been compiled, extensive information on Len's work by Roger, Tyler, Whiston, Evan, and others, is that he was such a restless soul, Len. He was resourceful, he was experimental but focused. And there became a point in his life in New Zealand where he realised that he would actually have to leave these shores to further the experiments that he wanted to do, primarily in film. So he headed to Sydney. And we know that he then had set his sights on getting to Europe, well, mainly to getting to Moscow, but before that he actually landed up in Samoa. And it suited this artist whose feeling for life was such a Polynesian one that was not so Eurocentric as those of his colleagues back in New Zealand. And when I was on the plane coming here from Brisbane, I actually watched the Buena Vista Social Club, and I thought, wow, this is actually getting me into the mood of Len. His total love of jazz, of body movement, of people coming together, of a zest for life. And this is totally reflected in his work. So in Samoa, we have recollections from him in his book No Trouble, and also I interviewed him in New York when I was doing some research on him as part of a thesis from London in 1979. And he said, I was after motion and I didn't quite know what kind of imagery to carry my motion, whether it should be dots or dashes or stripes or shapes or whatever that the form should be. I got a lot of kick out of the vitality of the Ocean Island art. And before he actually reached Western Samoa, he'd been putting himself to work and self-educating himself in Oceania art and African art through the Mitchell Library, through what he saw on display and elsewhere in Sydney, in the museum and the gallery. He'd been doing drawings of Papua New Guinea masks. He'd discovered Freud's totem and taboo, so he laboriously copied out passages of Freud, thinking, yeah, I'm going to need this later, maybe not now, I don't thoroughly understand it, but I know it's important. And it's interesting looking at the notebooks, which are actually projected page by page, not all of them in the current exhibition, so you can see this methodical recording of carvings, including Māori carvings. And he actually punctiliously labels them as though, you know, this is self-education. It's someone who is going to keep their notebooks, who's going to go back into those notebooks later in time. And it's a marvellous resource that they've actually survived. So he came across in either a book or a journal in Sydney, the wonderful Meyerhold Theatre in Moscow after the Russian Revolution, of course, was an outpouring of incredible creative endeavour in Russia. And he thought, wow, you know, I want to see this new theatre and the way that machine imagery is used to animate the actors as well as they animate it, you know, the synchronicity. And that in his head, you know, the designs of Larionov, for instance, were in the notebooks next door to a tribal sculpture. I mean, to him, there was an implicit interrelationship between this sort of imagery. He had the ability to cross synapses in his brain, if you like, in a very sober way, focused. So he tried to find a way of getting himself on a boat to Moscow. That didn't work, partly because he did not have language skills. However, as we know, he took the name of a stoker on board the Euripides in 1926, and there he was. I think it's Tom Burns or something like that, under the assumed name. He got this passage to London. He thought it was the next best thing. We'll go to London. This free spirit right from the start. Gets to London and thinks, well, okay, right, well, I figure that I can do some gardening. I'm used to labouring. Gets down to Hammersmith, meets the artistic coterie down there. They'd moved there, no longer in Chelsea, no longer in Bloomsbury. This was really the bohemian centre in the 20s, Hammersmith. It was cheap to live there. He got boarding, first of all, in a tiny little shed, a garden shed. Then he made friends with Eric Kennington, a sculptor, who said, well, why don't you share my studio? And there's another lady here who's a sculptor. And so, sure. This is a person who has a real charm to himself. Not boisterous, but has a sort of nobility of bearing, tall man, slim, virile, just great essence to him that people were attracted to in the Bohemian set. He was the sort of guy, a can-do, not a moaner. And they were all experimenting around Hammersmith, so he got into the fold. He was also used to living in places surrounded by water, and I guess if that's one insight I will bring, that I am, in looking through the imagery in the books before I came and saw this marvellous show on display, I was once again realised that the sea and the air is absolutely so crucial to Len's vision, I think. And remember that he came from a country that is surrounded by the sea. It's not the large continent of Australia. Comes to England. He's on a barge. He lives on water, and the constant movement of that. And that the artists that he's liaising with, including Ben Nicholson, who got him into the 7 and 5 Society, and I'll be getting onto that in a minute, they went to St Ives so often, right by the sea. It's the sort of Celtic coast. And to get some warmth, Len would go off with his friends Laura Riding and Robert Graves to Mallorca to get some warmth as well as cheap living. There again, it's by the sea, it's the strange sea creatures that you see. Samoa is right by the sea, the coral reef. I don't want to over-egg it, but it seems to me that it's quite a strong form. So I begin some of the images that give that feeling under the sea. And on the right of the screen is the book jacket that Season Press, Laura Riding and her partners set up in Mallorca. And this is Len's early collection of autobiographical memoirs, if you like, called No Trouble, and this is a cover which he designed. And it's flotsam, jetsam, combined with biomorphic forms from the sea, but also from genetics. And I saw this for the first time in the flesh, actually at the Hayward Gallery in the Dada and Surrealism Revisited show in 1976. I wasn't expecting to see Len Lye there, and there it was. Again, here is the sense of movement, of microbes, of sea creatures. This sort of imagery that fed into the batiks that he started making, partly for money, quite frankly. There was a whole fashion for batik since the 1990s in London. And he had contacts with a designer and also a batik producer factory next door to the Kennington studio he shared. So, he ended up doing these wonderfully vibrant silk scarves for artistic types, like, he did a Laura Riding scarf, for instance, and they were popular. But he also exhibited them in the 7 and 5 Society. So here we have a photogram that he was also experimenting with in London, and he exhibited several of those there, using plasticine to make the images. Also, of course, anyone like him who was interested in so-called tribal art would be attracted to looking at reproductions of Aboriginal tribal art, and he got hold of an 1899 book, seminal book in Sydney, and he laboriously looked at Central Desert body markings, etc., shield markings. I like to think, and I haven't looked at that book because it concentrates on Central Desert, but I'd like to think that Len might have known and come across images also of North Queensland shield images, and also of the Aboriginal tribal groups that are near the ocean towards the Torres Strait Islands, because that there again would tie in with the ocean's presence and with the imagery that flows through to the indigenous art of that region. These are from the sketchbook that it also includes, on our far right, Govett-Brewster, a sculptor from France. Len was attracted to through reproduction, thought the imagery had a tribal feel to it, but also had a mechanistic feel to it. He produced a sculpture unit, which is in the show here, which you can see and expresses a love of Brancusi's kiss, but this, of course, I think is far more dynamic than the Brancusi kiss. The Polynesian connection fed into batiks and paintings such as Polynesian Connection. I'll be getting onto the childlike, but here we're slightly on that primitive thing of the influence of Picasso that was persuasive in London at the time. The guitar-shaped double head effect. We can see, I've mentioned the Mayhold Theatre, and you can see Papova's stage set for the Magnanimous Cuckold. He would have loved that title, Magnanimous Cuckold. He probably roared with laughter over that. And his own animated effects of combining the machine aesthetic, a sense of movement, with the aspects of so-called primitive art that he had looked at through reproduction and in the flesh. And I'm going to leave that for a moment because I'm going to roar into the 7 and 5 Society, which really he got into the fold from 1927. Ben Nicholson was a driving force within this very loose-knit group of avant-garde artists who wanted to get away from staidness of English art, and actually also wanted to get away from the Bloomsbury group, which really colonised the London group exhibitions. So they set up the 7 and 5 Society. It was never only 7 painters and 5 sculptors. They were a very loose-knit group of artists. They existed from 1919 to 1937, and they included Frances Hodgkins at one time, as well as Len. I became interested when I was in London researching in the group through Frances Hodgkins, and then definitely through Len Lye. And this was the type of art then that was happening in England. I mean, we see it as pretty staid now, but it was pretty experimental then. We have Claude Flight, who was famous for his lino cuts of painting on the left, which is slight sort of vorticist futurist tendencies. We have a view of St Ives, I think it's St Ives by Ben Nicholson's first wife. Sorry to introduce her as that, Winifred, but I'm afraid Barbara Hepworth entered the scene not long after. Then we can see the effects of Ferdinand Léger on certain people, like Sidney Hunt. We can see Claude Flight's speed. So I made a mistake before. It was actually, would you believe, Ivan Hitchens, who later went very lyrical on them. But the childness, this was really an interest in St Ives that Ben Nicholson had, and Barbara Nicholson, particularly Ben Nicholson, in the so-called naive painter Alfred Wallace. And he did paintings on little bits of wood hanging around and drawings, which were, they were like children's drawings, and the whole idea was to get away from the stuffiness of the academy. That was absolutely the way of doing it. And so Ben Nicholson did his own drawings. And then you get Cedric Morrison doing these really anatomically incorrect paintings, such as this weird painter in Brittany, France. And then you get Pill Creek, Cornwall again, Ben Nicholson, trying his dash with a sort of an Alfred Wallace flavour. Frances Hodgkins, well, she was very much attracted by this inside-outside way of setting up still lives, and Wings Over the Water was shown. Then you get the push towards abstraction because the Abstraction Création group in Paris was causing attention, ripples across the waters to London, and Ben Nicholson and architects and designers in London were getting very interested to see this new abstraction that was emerging. And so John Piper had a go. Ben Nicholson started infusing Picasso-esque marks into his still lives. And then in the same year as John Piper's, we get Barbara Hepworth's wonderful discs in Echelon. So they were in 7 and 5, and this was at the time when, in fact, Len was exhibiting with them. Now, just to show the extraordinary shifts that these artists made during the time, their experimentation, they're young. Ben Nicholson, 2 paintings from 1933. One, Saint-Remy, Provence, which is very definitely in the silhouette style of Picasso at the time, and then his move towards abstraction, very much with the Celtic coastal flavour of Cornwall 6 circles. Nicholson really tightened up the 7 and 5 society to the extent that he expelled all the lyrical painters, so to speak, and that included Frances Hodgkins. And because Len was never someone who wanted to be locked into a particular thesis or a particular group's manifesto, he also departed before the final exhibition at Swimmers Gallery. Swimmers, of course, is well known in London and as a bookstore. So this is the type of imagery that was shown, and there was a remarkably reduced number of artists showing at the stage, and really this tight programmatic move towards abstraction meant that the society would not exist in its open-ended manner and would not accommodate such freewheeling spirits like Len Lye. So it became something else. It turned into another group. I think it was called the Circle, which was which looked at abstraction and design, and it was very much part of the 1930s clean-cut abstraction movement in London. Now, this isn't where Len was at all. This is the type of environment which one suspects would and possibly does have a Len Lye, although Tyler would know whether it has or not. But this is the type of company that Len Lye kept in his London years. This is Jim Eade's place. He was a former curator at the Tate Gallery, and he was a great collector of artists from the 20s and the 30s. And there are wall hangings. There's really this melding of pottery, of sculpture, of paintings. It's a non-programmatic group of works. It's very much the sort of English Bauhaus, if you like, getting together of the visual arts and not distinguishing between so-called craft design and the visual arts. Now, for Len, the one surrealist who really did appeal to him a great deal is Jean Miro, and one knows why. I mean, I think that if you look, even though Miro's left-handed, I've looked at this painting on the right, and I've realised it's not done by a right-handed man, it's actually done by a left-hand. So I'm saying that because Len Lye's work on display at the moment, particularly the drawings, demand that you look very closely. It's almost a miniaturist technique, and so that sort of observation of whether it's done with the right hand or the left hand is apposite because he's into bodily movement. Now, also what I would have appealed to him about Miro, who of course he knew because in New York he did a photogram, and it's in the show down below, one version. And I have the vision of the current surrealism show that's on at Queensland Art Gallery in Brisbane at the moment, is that Miro's work doesn't have an obvious landscape orientation, and it doesn't have an obvious top, bottom, left, right hands. It's as though the imagery can be turned upside down and still be legible. And when I look back, this is what I feel about Len, and I feel that it makes him stand apart from a great deal of the surrealists who are still locked into the ground and into the top. And it suggests to me that it's an artist who is not hidebound by convention and pictorial terms in any way. Now, that is partly dictated by the batiks he did for scarves, etc. But it's also his knowledge of the Samoan tapa cloth designs and the way that they can be switched around every which way. It's the lava that he wore when he was living in Western Samoa. It's to do with this whole immersion in there is no fixed way of looking at things. And another thing that I would say that makes him drawn to the Miro type work and also to children's art. Children move their drawings around, of course. And he's maintained, and he calls it, he knew all about clay. He was a highly knowledgeable artist, Len Lye. But he appreciated the conscious getting back into a childlike state in order to produce vigour and new ways of actually interpreting the world. That's why he was attracted to children's art, as the surrealists were indeed. He was also, as they were, attracted to people who are in different states of being, whether they might be people with mental disorders or those in a trance state. There is another thing that I would also say, that by and large, Len is very generous towards the female figure or suggestion of the female figure in his work, which is unlike most of the surrealists. I am absolutely, it's reinforced by the exhibition I've seen in Brisbane, where in fact the misogyny that is shown through the treatment of the female is extremely marked, whereas with Len there's a generosity of spirit towards the female which stands him apart. I mean, you may think that's quite a small point, but it's not really if you're a woman and you are interested in how the female is depicted throughout. Now, he had great fun in Mallorca, collecting bits and flotsam bits of things to make frottages. Obviously Max Ernst had done this as well, but Len was very much doing it from his own standpoint. And it served into photograms, which he used plasticine and bits of sticks, etc., to photograph without a camera. And he was included in the famous Herbert Reed surrealism book, 1936, with a version of On People, which he called Marks and Spencer Meets in a Japanese Garden. And of course, you know, the title alone is so surreal. The English, the London's response to surrealism was to hold their show, and there's one of the exhibits that Len put in, very much like the mark makings in caves by Indigenous peoples. And just an oddball. When I was in Australia thinking about what I'd do here with this talk, I thought, you know, there's one place that Len Lye could really have great fun in, and that's the Museum of Old and New Art on the Derwent River in Hobart. David Walsh, himself a free-thinking and extremely visionary person, has created this collection based on sex, death and belief. And for those of you who may anticipate seeing this museum, or in fact have been there, you will realise that you plummet down to the ground floor via a circular lift, or you can walk down through a circular staircase. And before you get there, you can do a very Len Lye thing. You can almost imagine yourself playing a game of tennis on the court outside the entrance. And then you can do another Len Lye thing, and you can cast your eyes to one side over the Derwent, and you can see that underfoot is actually a garden of wild plants, which you can randomly run your eyes over and imagine dancing on. And inside, it's dark, and it's very theatrically lit, and there's movement and there's sound, and it's very much, I would say, a place for Len Lye. Thank you.